Beijing, Forbidden City, March 14, 1521. A 19-year-old woman stands in a windowless chamber, listening to the funeral drums echo through the palace walls. Her husband, the Zhengde emperor, is dead. She has been his wife for 7 years. She thinks she's finally free. She's wrong. The door opens. 3 elderly women enter carrying white silk. They don't speak. They don't need to. She knows what the silk means. She knows what happens next. Her name was Empress Xia. And for the next 40 years, she would live in a tomb of her own making. Not buried underground, but far worse, buried alive, locked in a palace she could never leave, forbidden from speaking to men, forbidden from wearing colors, forbidden from laughing, from singing, from feeling the sun on her face for more than a few minutes each year. 40 years of white clothing. 40 years of silence. 40 years of waiting to die so she could finally join a man she had barely known. But Empress Xia was lucky. At least she was still breathing. Because across Asia, from China to India to Korea, millions of women survived their husbands only to discover that death would have been mercy. That the real punishment for being a widow wasn't grief, it was living with that grief forever while the world made absolutely certain you could never forget it, not even for a single day. I'm stripped historian, and here we don't look away from the stories that history buried because they were too horrifying to remember. If you believe these women deserve to be heard, support this channel with a like and subscribe. Because what comes next, your textbooks deliberately left out. This isn't one woman's story. This isn't even one country's story. Between 1400 and 1900, tens of millions of women across Asia faced systematic punishment for the crime of surviving their husbands. And I do mean crime. Because in Confucian China, Hindu India, and Joseon Korea, a widow who outlived her husband was considered contaminated property, someone who had failed in her primary duty, which was to die alongside him. The numbers are staggering. In China, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, over 3 million widows were documented as living in enforced confinement. That's just the ones in official records. The real number? Historians estimate it could be 3 times higher. In India, British colonial records from 1813 documented 839 sooty burnings in Bengal province alone, in a single year. That's more than 2 widows burned alive every single day. And Bengal was just one province out of dozens. In Korea, Confucian law required widows to remain in mourning for 3 full years, wearing only white, eating no meat, speaking to no men outside their immediate family. But 3 years was just the minimum. Most widows never left mourning at all. They stayed in white for 20, 30, 40 years, until death finally released them. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't secret. This was state policy, backed by law, enforced by officials, celebrated as virtue. Let me tell you about Lady Zheng. Lady Zheng was 16 years old when she married a mid-level official in the Ming dynasty named Wang Cheng. She met him twice before the wedding, both times with chaperones present, both conversations lasting less than 5 minutes. She was 17 when he died of fever. They had been married for 9 months. She barely knew his voice. She didn't know his favorite foods, his childhood stories, whether he had been kind or cruel. She knew almost nothing about him. But according to Confucian law, she now belonged to him forever. The mourning period began immediately. Lady Zheng's colorful wedding robes were stripped from her body and burned. She was dressed head to toe in coarse white hemp cloth, the color of death, the color of mourning. Her hair, which she had spent years growing long and beautiful, was cut short as a sign of grief. Then they took her to the widow's quarters. Not a room. Not an apartment. A compound specifically designed to house widows within the family estate. High walls. Narrow windows. A single gate that was locked from the outside every night. Inside lived Wang Cheng's mother, his grandmother, 2 aunts who had also lost their husbands, and now Lady Zheng. 5 women, all in white, living in permanent mourning for men who were years or decades dead. The rules were absolute. No colored clothing. Ever. White was the only color a widow could wear. Some women spent 40, 50 years in white and forgot what other colors even looked like. No meat. Widows ate only vegetables and rice. Meat was considered too indulgent for someone in mourning. No leaving the compound without permission from the male head of household, now Wang Cheng's younger brother, a man 3 years younger than Lady Zheng who held absolute authority over her life. No speaking to unrelated men. If a male servant entered the room, Lady Zheng had to turn her face to the wall until he left. No remarriage. To even suggest remarriage was to disgrace not just herself, but her entire birth family. Her parents would be shamed. Her siblings' marriage prospects would be ruined. The pressure was absolute. Lady Zheng was 17 years old. She would live in that compound, wearing white, eating vegetables, speaking to almost no one, for the next 63 years. She died at age 80, still in mourning, still in white, still waiting for permission to stop grieving that never came. When she died, the local magistrate praised her as a model of Confucian virtue. Her name was inscribed on a memorial arch as an example for other widows to follow. This is what they called honor. But Lady Zheng's fate was merciful compared to what awaited widows in other parts of Asia. In India, the practice of sati, widow burning, had existed for over 1,000 years, but it reached its peak between 1600 and 1850. The word sati comes from Sanskrit, meaning good woman. Think about that. The word for good woman and the word for widow burning herself alive were the same word. Here's how it worked. When a high-caste Hindu man died, his body was placed on a funeral pyre, a massive pile of wood built specifically for cremation. According to tradition, his widow was expected to climb onto that pyre, sit beside her husband's corpse, and burn to death alongside him. This wasn't suicide. Suicide implied choice. This was social execution with a religious veneer. If a widow refused, the consequences were devastating. Her head was shaved completely bald, a mark of disgrace so severe that people would spit on her in the street. She was forbidden from attending any family celebrations, weddings, festivals, or religious ceremonies. Her very presence was considered polluted, capable of bringing bad luck. She lost all inheritance rights. Everything her husband owned went to his male relatives. She owned nothing, not even the clothes on her back. She became a servant in her dead husband's household, forced to work for her in-laws for the rest of her life with no pay, no status, no hope of escape. And worst of all, she was blamed for her husband's death. Society believed that a woman whose husband died young must have been cursed, must have done something terrible in a past life to deserve such karma. So most widows chose the pyre. Not because they wanted to die, but because the alternative was decades of living hell with no escape and no hope of anything better. British colonial officer James Peggs witnessed a sooty burning in 1828 near Benares. He described it in his journal, and his account is one of the most detailed we have. The widow was a girl of perhaps 19 years. She walked to the pyre calmly, assisted by 2 Brahmin priests. They had given her opium. I could see it in her eyes, the way she moved, too smooth, too dreamlike. Without the opium, they told me, the widows sometimes try to escape once the flames begin. They placed her next to her husband's body. She was dressed in her wedding sari, red and gold. They bound her wrists and ankles, not tightly, they assured the crowd, just enough to help her maintain the proper seated position. The priests chanted prayers. The crowd watched in silence. Then they lit the fire. It started slowly, small flames at the edges. Then the wind caught it. Within seconds, the entire pyre was engulfed. I heard her scream, just once, a sound I will never forget, before the smoke became too thick to see through. The crowd cheered. They called her blessed. They said she had achieved moksha, liberation. I vomited in the street afterward. No one else seemed disturbed. This was the 3rd sooty burning that month in that town alone. James Peggs estimated he personally witnessed or heard reports of over 300 sooty burnings during his 12 years in India. 300 women, burned alive, while crowds celebrated. But what happened to the women who survived? The ones who refused the pyre and chose to live? Let me tell you about Rup Kunwar. Wait, wrong date. Rup Kunwar's story happened in 1987. Yes, you heard that right. 1987, not 1887. Not 1787. Rup Kunwar was 18 years old, married for 8 months, when her husband died of illness in Rajasthan, India. On September 4, 1987, she was burned alive on his funeral pyre. This wasn't ancient history. This was 37 years ago. People alive today watched it happen. Over 8,000 people attended the burning. Thousands more came in the following days to worship at the site. Within weeks, a temple was built there. Rup Kunwar was declared a goddess. The Indian government investigated. They charged several family members with murder. But every witness claimed Rup Kunwar had gone willingly, that she had walked to the pyre with a smile, that she had achieved spiritual liberation. The case collapsed. No one was convicted. Here's what investigators later uncovered. Rup Kunwar had tried to escape the morning of the burning. Neighbors heard her screaming inside the house. Her in-laws had locked her in a room while they prepared the pyre. She was given something to drink, likely opium or sedatives, before being brought outside. She was physically held down on the pyre by male relatives while the fire was lit. But 8,000 witnesses saw nothing, heard nothing, remembered only her willing sacrifice. This is the power of tradition. This is what happens when culture becomes more important than human life. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Between 1947, when India gained independence, and 2012, there were at least 40 documented sooty burnings in India. The real number is likely much higher. Most happen in rural areas where authorities never investigate. But let's return to China, to the Forbidden City, to the women who survived and wished they hadn't. The Forbidden City in Beijing held over 9,000 rooms. But for the widows of dead emperors, only a handful of those rooms mattered, the ones in the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility. Ironic name for a prison. When an emperor died, all his consorts, concubines, and secondary wives who hadn't borne sons faced a choice. Option 1, voluntary burial. Follow the emperor into death. During the Ming dynasty, this was not just encouraged, it was required for childless consorts. They were given white silk, locked in a room, and expected to hang themselves within 24 hours of the emperor's death. Ming dynasty records show that when Emperor Yongle died in 1424, 30 consorts were buried with him. 30 women, ordered to die, because their only purpose had been to serve a man who no longer needed serving. Option 2, live, but never leave the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility. Ever. For any reason. Most chose option 2. But was it really better? Let me describe what life was like for an imperial widow. Daily schedule. 4 a.m., wake. Dress in white mourning robes. 5 a.m., morning prayers at the emperor's memorial shrine. 6 a.m., breakfast. Plain rice congee. No meat, no spices, no flavor. Widows ate the blandest food imaginable as a mark of perpetual mourning. 7 a.m. to 12 p.m., needlework. Embroidering religious texts. Copying Buddhist sutras. Endless, mindless repetition designed to fill empty hours. 12 p.m., lunch. More rice. Sometimes vegetables. 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., more needlework. More copying sutras. The days blurred together into an infinite gray sameness. 6 p.m., dinner. Rice again. 7 p.m., evening prayers. 8 p.m., sleep. Every single day. For decades. No entertainment. No music, too joyful for mourning. No theater. No festivals. No visitors except female relatives and eunuch servants. The Palace of Compassion and Tranquility had gardens, but widows rarely visited them. Fresh air and sunlight were considered inappropriate for women in mourning. Think about this, you're 22 years old. Your husband, whom you met 3 times before marriage, dies. You're locked in a palace. You will never leave. You will never remarry. You will never have children. You will never wear colors. You will never laugh in public. You will do nothing but wait to die for the next 40, 50, 60 years. This was the fate of Empress Dowager Xian, who entered the Forbidden City at age 16 as a consort of the Xianfeng Emperor. He died when she was 24. She lived in the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility for the next 37 years, until her death at age 61. 37 years of white clothing. 37 years of the same prayers, the same rooms, the same gray monotony. When she finally died in 1881, attendants cleaning her quarters found something hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. A collection of colored silk ribbons. Red, blue, green, yellow. Hidden away, never worn, just looked at in private moments when no one was watching. A 61-year-old woman, hiding ribbons like a child with contraband, because colored fabric was the closest thing she'd had to freedom in nearly 4 decades. But here's the part that makes this story even darker. The system wasn't enforced primarily by men. It was enforced by other women. In China, the oldest widow in a household held absolute power over younger widows. She decided how strictly the rules would be followed. She determined punishments for violations. And most of these elderly widows, who had suffered through decades of confinement themselves, didn't show mercy. They showed ruthless cruelty. Because they had endured it, so everyone else must endure it too. Because their suffering had been declared virtuous, so any attempt to reduce suffering was an insult to their virtue. In India, it was often the mother-in-law who pressured widows toward sati. Not the dead husband's father. Not his brothers. His mother. Anthropologist Jonathan Perry interviewed dozens of elderly Indian women in the 1980s who had witnessed sati burnings in their youth. He asked them why they had supported it. Their answers were chilling. If she doesn't burn, who will care for her? Better to die with honor than live as a burden. We all made sacrifices. Why should she be special? A good wife follows her husband everywhere. Even into death. This is Dharma. These weren't monsters. These were women who had internalized their own oppression so completely that they voluntarily became its enforcers. In Korea, the situation was even more complex. Confucian widow laws were enforced by other widows who served as community moral police. They watched younger widows constantly, reported any violations, testified against them in local courts. A widow caught wearing colored clothing, even in private, could be brought before the magistrate. Her punishment? Public humiliation, beating with bamboo rods, and permanent marking as a woman of loose morals. Her children would be barred from taking civil service exams. Her entire family would be disgraced. One woman, caught wearing a pink hairpin hidden under her white mourning veil, was beaten 30 strokes with a bamboo rod in the town square while other widows watched and applauded. The system survived because women enforced it on each other. But not every widow accepted her fate. Some fought back. And what happened to them reveals just how brutal the system really was. In 1821, a young Chinese widow named Wu Xinyang made a decision that would shock her entire province. Her husband died after 2 years of marriage. She was 19 years old. The family expected her to enter mourning, wear white, move to the widow's quarters, live out her days in isolation. Instead, Wu Xinyang did the unthinkable. She announced she intended to remarry. The scandal was immediate. Her in-laws disowned her. Her birth parents, terrified of the disgrace, locked her in their home to prevent her from going through with it. Wu Xinyang escaped. She walked 40 miles to the provincial capital and filed a petition with the magistrate, requesting legal permission to remarry. The magistrate was stunned. No widow had ever made such a request in his 20-year career. He denied it. Wu Xinyang appealed to the governor. The governor denied it. She appealed all the way to the imperial court in Beijing. The court's response was swift and brutal. Wu Xinyang was sentenced to 60 strokes of the heavy bamboo for bringing disgrace to the institution of widowhood. 60 strokes with the heavy bamboo was often a death sentence. The bamboo rods were 2 inches thick. Each strike broke skin, fractured bones. Most people lost consciousness by stroke 20. Wu Xinyang survived. Barely. She was returned to her husband's family, where she was locked in the widow's quarters under permanent guard. She lived another 42 years, never remarrying, never escaping, never speaking of her rebellion again. But her name became legend. For decades afterward, young widows across China whispered about the woman who tried to be free. In India, widow resistance took a different form. After the British colonial government officially banned sati in 1829, though enforcement was sporadic for another century, many widows expected their lives to improve. They were wrong. With sati no longer available as an honorable escape, Hindu families simply made widows' lives even more miserable, hoping they would die of natural causes quickly. Widows were moved to holy cities, particularly Vrindavan and Varanasi, where they were essentially abandoned. Dumped in widow houses run by temples, given minimal food, expected to spend 18 hours a day begging and praying. A census in 1881 counted over 20,000 widows living in Vrindavan alone. Most were under 30 years old. They slept in overcrowded rooms, 30 to 40 women to a single space. They ate one meal per day, rice and lentils, nothing else. Many didn't survive their first year. By 1900, over 100,000 widows lived in widow houses across India, locked in a system that treated them as non-persons waiting to die. The formal systems of widow punishment began collapsing in the early 20th century. China's Qing dynasty fell in 1912, and the new republic officially ended in forced widow mourning. But social pressure continued for decades. Even today, in rural areas of China, widows face stigma and expectations that echo old traditions. India banned sati multiple times, 1829, 1956, 1987 after Rup Kunwar's death. Each ban was followed by continued burnings, just hidden better. Korea abolished widow confinement laws in 1894, but social expectations persisted well into the 1960s. But the psychological damage lasted generations. Millions of women spent their entire adult lives in mourning for men they barely knew. They internalized the belief that their only value came from their relationship to a husband. That surviving him was a moral failure requiring a lifetime of penance. Think about what this did to mothers and daughters. A girl growing up watching her mother suffer in white, watching her grandmother suffer in white, learning that this was normal, that this was expected, that this was what happened to women. How do you build a sense of self-worth when your entire culture tells you that your life ended the moment your husband died? How do you find joy when joy itself is forbidden? How do you survive decades of being told you should have died? Some couldn't. Suicide rates among young widows in 19th-century China, India, and Korea were astronomical, though rarely recorded officially because suicide was considered shameful. Others went mad. Ming Dynasty records mention widows who lost their minds, and had to be physically restrained or locked in isolated rooms until they died. And the ones who survived with their sanity intact? They carried scars that never healed. Empress Xia, the woman we met at the beginning, lived 40 years in the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility after the Xunda Emperor died. 40 years in white. 40 years of prayers for a man she had barely known. 40 years waiting for death. When she finally died in 1561 at age 59, her last words, recorded by attending ladies, were heartbreaking. Has it been long enough? 40 years wasn't enough. There was no enough. There was only enduring until the body gave out. And here's what makes this story so important. This wasn't ancient history. This happened to women your great-grandmothers knew. Women who lived when electricity existed, when photographs existed, when the modern world was already forming. The last legally enforced widow confinement in Korea ended in 1972. The last documented sati burning was in 2008 in rural Madhya Pradesh, India. The year the iPhone 3G was released. The year Barack Obama was elected. The year you probably remember. These systems didn't end because cultures suddenly became enlightened. They ended because women fought back, because reformers risked their lives challenging traditions, because enough people finally said, "This is wrong," but millions of women died before that happened. Millions more survived and wished they hadn't, and billions of people today have never heard their stories because history textbooks skip the uncomfortable parts, the parts that make civilizations look barbaric, the parts that reveal how recently we were monsters to half the human race. Their names were Wu Xinyang, and Rup Kunwar, and Empress Xia, and Lady Zheng, and 10 million others whose names no one recorded because they weren't important enough to remember. They survived emperors, they survived husbands, they survived death itself. And then they spent decades being punished for it. Now you know. Now you remember, which means they didn't suffer in silence forever. If you want more history that others refuse to tell, subscribe to the Stripped History. Because we don't look away. Not ever. Tell me in the comments, which historical culture should we expose next? What other buried truths need to be brought to light, because these women deserved better than to be forgotten. And so do all the others we haven't talked about yet.